Can Zach Wilson build on a strong start to his preseason? We'll discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, August 10th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Visit UnderdogFantasy.com or find them in the App Store and sign up with promo code LOCKEDON to get your first deposit doubled up to $100. Well, the Jets are in Carolina today, just as they were yesterday, conducting joint practices with the Panthers ahead of Saturday's preseason game. And today we are going to focus on that preseason game. We're going to talk about some offensive players to watch for the Jets. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you may see a new background. Get used to new backgrounds, folks, because I'm going to be traveling a lot in the weeks ahead. We probably won't see the traditional background until after Labor Day. A lot of August travel for me, so I'll be sure to fill you in on where I am each day. But we'll still keep doing the daily podcast, so I'll stay in touch with you and stay on top of the New York Jets. And we have our second preseason game of the year, Saturday against the Carolina Panthers. Today we're focusing on offense. Tomorrow we'll focus on some defensive players to watch. Now, all eyes are on Aaron Rodgers when it comes to the New York Jets, but I think in preseason, Rodgers is not going to play much, if at all. And I think there are arguments to be made either way. To be honest with you, I kind of lean towards playing your guys for a couple of reasons. I think that the practices are not as intense as they used to be, so I don't know that they really help players get into football shape the way they used to. So really, you have to rely on preseason games to get your guys into shape. And I'm a convert to this. I used to think preseason was totally useless. If you go back years, you probably hear me complaining about the number of preseason games. I've kind of changed my mind about that over the last couple of years, especially in 2020 when there was no preseason. And there actually was a study done that showed that there was a statistically significant correlation between more injuries early in 2020 and the lack of preseason. So difficult to say, why teams, choose their philosophies. I think there's an argument to be made to keep your guys on the bench because obviously there's a huge injury risk. So one of your guys gets injured playing a preseason game, you get criticized until, for decades because people will say, well, why was that guy out there in a meaningless game risking injury? So you can see it either way, but I think the Jets will lean more towards not playing their starters, and that's defensible. I think either way, I don't have a huge issue with it, but if Aaron Rodgers and the starters aren't going to play much, then I think all eyes are really on Zach Wilson. And I thought Zach Wilson's preseason got off to a good start. Of course, 3 for 5, had the big 57-yard completion last Thursday night in Canton, Ohio. It was good. I thought it was a positive moment for Zach Wilson. I don't know it was quite as good as Chris Collinsworth on NBC was making it out to be. Chris Collinsworth was talking about how all the monumental progress Zach Wilson made. And it's like, he was in there for 2 series. He threw 5 passes. I don't know that you can make monumental progress in 5 passes, but still, I think an encouraging start, especially the big play. And I think as much as anything this preseason, it's partially about trying to develop Zach Wilson a little bit because these are the only real game reps he's going to get through 2023, unless, of course, there's an injury to Aaron Rodgers. But as the backup quarterback, he's going to be working mainly on the practice field. And I think there's some value to that. But I don't think there's anything more valuable than live game action. The problem is that the NFL does not have a developmental league. It does not have a minor league system. So in an ideal world, Zach Wilson would be playing games that are kind of off the radar. Nobody cares about. There's not going to be a ton of media pressure. There's not going to be a ton of fan pressure because his team would not need to win, and his team winning or losing would not impact the Jets in a developmental league or a minor league. So preseason is really the only opportunity you've got. In fact, I'll take it a step further. I think that every preseason snap this year at the quarterback position should be taken by either Aaron Rodgers or by Zach Wilson. I don't know what you're accomplishing by putting Tim Boyle out there. If you're going to put Tim Boyle out there, you might as well not even play the games as far as I'm concerned. And I think you have to find some meaning in these games if you're going to play them. I don't think Tim Boyle is a useful player for the Jets. I don't think giving him these reps accomplishes much of anything. And I probably would have said the same about Chris Streveler, although Streveler at least has like that August history. But if in case you missed it, he was waived this week and then reverted to injured reserve. It's kind of a mechanism NFL teams have to use at this time of year to get players onto IR. They have to first place them on waivers. And the reason for that is they don't want teams pretending players are injured just to stash them on IR for the year when they're not going to make the team. They want to give, if players are actually healthy, they want to give other teams a chance to claim them. But Streveler is on IR. But again, I don't see what would be accomplished by giving Tim Boyle snaps. I don't see what was accomplished by giving Tim Boyle all of those snaps in the Hall of Fame game. I think Zach Wilson should go out there. And part of the reason is I think this preseason is important for rebuilding Zach Wilson's confidence, which has to be shattered after what happened last year and then to a lesser extent the year before. If you're trying to rebuild Zach Wilson, you got to get him believing in himself again. And look, say what you will about Zach, and I certainly have said my fair share. And I don't think a lot of what's said about Zach Wilson is unfair. When you've been benched a year and a half into your career as the number 2 overall pick, that's pretty bad. And you saw what happened last year. You saw him kind of lose the confidence of the locker room. So say what you will. And he's been really bad. Look, there's no way around it. Zach Wilson, if you watched Hard Knocks the other night, Zach Wilson's the first one to admit this has not gone the way he'd hoped it would go. So the Jets are kind of trying to rebuild him. And he does have 22 starts under his belt. Yeah, I think that if you put him against these preseason defenses, there are going to be a lot of second teamers, a lot of third teamers, practice squad guys, maybe even some guys who won't even make a practice squad, he's going to do really well. He's going to tear them up. I remember 5 years ago in 2018, Teddy Bridgewater, he was coming off a very serious knee injury from a couple of years earlier. He was with the Jets in preseason. He was kind of like an insurance policy that year in case the Jets did not pick a quarterback early in the draft. And then they ended up picking Sam Darnold, and Teddy kind of became superfluous. The Jets just essentially stuck him out there in the second half of preseason games, and he dominated. And people are like, oh, wow, Teddy Bridgewater looks amazing. Teddy Bridgewater is going to be an impact quarterback this year. And it was like, no, he's an experienced quarterback going up against guys who aren't NFL players. And that was, of course, the case. People, it was kind of silly, the overreaction to Teddy playing great against. It was good. I mean, it was good to see him back on the field. It was good to see him show an ability to take a hit and get back up from it coming off a serious injury. But mainly, these are the types of situations that can help build confidence for a young quarterback because he's better than everybody on the field. He's got more experience than everybody on the field. It's an opportunity to go out and light things up. And then the narrative starts to become that, hey, Zach Wilson's looking pretty good because you even saw it Thursday night against Cleveland in the Hall of Fame game, the way Collinsworth was gushing about 5 passes. And you want to build that narrative. So, I mean, as much as I'm criticizing the way Collinsworth reacted to it, it's kind of a good thing for the Jets because you build a little momentum. And then the buzz becomes, hey, Zach Wilson, maybe he's on the rebound. And that's what you want. You kind of want to build this narrative because then the positive vibes kind of go to Zach Wilson. He hears about them. And it really feels like the media wants this Zach Wilson storyline, the Zach Wilson redemption arc. It really feels like this is an angle they're trying to push. So I think the Jets should lean into it. Yes, I understand. I know what the rebuttal is going to be. He's the backup quarterback. You don't want to risk getting him injured. I understand that. It's a fair argument to make. But if the Jets are actually trying to make this work with Zach Wilson going forward, which they say they are, you also are kind of like on this second track where, yes, he's your number 2 quarterback, but you're also trying to work with him and improve his game. And, at least that one throw, that 57-yard completion, that was on the money. It was a great throw by Zach. And it's the type of thing, if it keeps happening, and I think it will keep happening if he continues to play against these backups, against these guys who aren't really NFL caliber players, you'll continue to see that confidence grow. You'll continue to see Zach Wilson look good. So I hope he gets plenty of reps in this game. I don't think they'll give him every rep that Aaron Rodgers doesn't get. I think they should, but I hope he plays at least a little bit deeper into the game. Let him play into the second half. Let him accumulate some stats. Let this be one of the storylines for the preseason this year for the Jets in 2023. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to another young player. It's a player Zach Wilson's probably going to be receiving snaps from against Carolina. That's Joe Tippmann. And we'll talk about what this game could mean for Joe Tippmann as we continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. August is here, and you know what that means. It is the official start of fantasy football season, and it's fantasy football draft month. You can get your championship ready for your home league by trying out the best ball on Underdog Fantasy. All you do is one live snake draft, no waivers, no trades. Underdog sets your best lineup each week. Try it out with Underdog's Best Ball Mania Tournament, the largest fantasy football contest of all. it's back, and it's even bigger with $15 million in total prizes up for grabs, including an absurd $3 million going to the winner. And last year, the winner drafted their team in July, so don't wait around. You're already kind of behind right now. Get to Underdog Fantasy. Visit underdogfantasy.com or find them in the App Store and sign up with promo code Locked On to get your first deposit doubled up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Locked On. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes through the week each day, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. Today, we are talking about Jets offensive players to watch in preseason game number 2 this Saturday against the Carolina Panthers. Tomorrow, if you're an everydayer, you'll hear about defensive players to watch. Now, we've talked about Zach Wilson, the quarterback. Let's talk about a guy who he's going to be receiving snaps from in this game, and that's Joe Tippmann, the rookie center out of Wisconsin, second-round pick, and a guy who, I have to be honest with you, I'm a little disappointed. Doesn't seem to be making a huge push to start right now. But that first game against Cleveland, I don't think he was bad. I think he looked okay. And this could easily be a situation where it's just a slower build. And everything I just said about Zach Wilson, talking about the reps, talking about building confidence. I mean, Tippmann, second-round pick against guys who play the second half of preseason games, usually maybe practice squad candidates, guys who are at the very bottom of the depth chart. It's a good venue to build confidence because you're typically going to be more talented than these guys as a second-round pick. You'll have a chance to dominate them. You'll have a chance to throw some impressive film up there. You get some praise in the film room during the week if you do your job effectively. I thought Tippmann held up well in pass protection. I thought as a run blocker, everybody kind of, I can't put it on Tippmann. I mean, it's one of those things. It's tough to run block in the preseason because these offensive lines are just being thrown together, and you're essentially offensive line being thrown into a blender. And so much about offensive line play is chemistry, it's continuity, it's knowing the way the guy next to you is going to react. It's knowing that you can pass a guy off to him. It's the type of stuff you build over time, and you don't really have that chance in preseason. So it's kind of difficult to judge offensive line play in preseason. I thought Tippmann did not look bad in the opener against Cleveland. Now, I don't think the Jets want to depend on Zach Wilson this year. I mean, that's cutting edge analysis right there. The Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers, so they don't really want Zach Wilson to play this year. I mean, you might want to record that one. You might want to hit the rewind button just to hear that again. That was such cutting edge as a take when we're talking about the 2023 Jets. I think the Jets do have plans for Joe Tippmann to play some sort of role on this team this year. And I'll go back to, I've said this for months. I think the Jets wanted Tippmann to just grab the starting job. It's difficult to say what's going on in camp, especially on the offensive line. It's difficult to evaluate that on a play-to-play basis. It doesn't feel like the Jets view Tippmann as a day one starter. And on some level, that's okay because you do have Connor McGovern back. So Tippmann does have a chance to develop at a slower pace. I would have liked to have seen him make a bigger push, but sometimes what you get in rookies is guys who aren't necessarily ready to start on day one, but guys who work hard through training camp and improve their game and continue working on the practice field as the regular season begins. And sometimes, maybe even if they're not ready to play early, mid-September, they're ready to go when they're called upon, when there's an injury. Maybe it's in October, maybe it's in November, because believe it or not, players actually are capable of improvement in this league, especially rookies. It's really hard to enter this league as a rookie. In fact, I think sometimes we kind of lose track of how difficult it is. When you think about the football stuff alone, new playbook, which is probably more complex than what you ran in college, different coaching staff, different types of coaching, all that stuff, more difficult opponents who you can't just beat with raw physical ability, raw strength, because everybody's strong, everybody's athletic in the NFL. You have to beat them with technique. And this doesn't even touch on the stuff off the field, whether you're talking about not being in college anymore, that this is your actual job, that you have to make meals for yourself. A lot. It's not easy. And over the course of the first year, for a lot of players, you find your groove. You figure it out, both on the field and off the field. And I can't speak to whether or not this is true of Tippmann, but it's true of a lot of players. So even if Tippmann's not ready to go week one, if he's ready when the Jets call upon him, and we've seen this in the past where sometimes a rookie is not a week one starter. I mean, somehow Garrett Wilson was not a week one starter last year. Now that one may be more on the coaching staff, but go back to 2004. A guy I have in mind is Jonathan Vilma, who wasn't a starter week one and maybe could have been, but stepped into the lineup when the Jets had an injury at linebacker and never gave the spot back until Eric Mangini came. But that's another story. Tippmann could be a guy who plays a big role for the Jets this year because we know this offensive line's got a lot of question marks. We know that there are question marks about the depth, and having a guy as talented as Tippmann with your second team, that could be a game changer for this Jets team this year. Because if there's an injury, where do you go? And we already are dealing with some stuff. Dwayne Brown still hasn't really taken the practice field yet. Mekhi Becton seems like he's still feeling the lingering impacts of that knee injury. I mean, he's talked about discomfort that he felt before the Hall of Fame game, which limited his snaps. So already at the tackle position, you got question marks. And that could lead you to eventually kicking Elijah Vera Tucker out to tackle. That's going to be a consideration at some point for the Jets, just as it was a year ago. So that means an interior line spot may open up. So even if Tippmann's not ready for center, even if he's not ready to call out the line assignments, if he's not ready to scan the defense and make the calls, could he play guard potentially? There's a school of thought that Tippmann can play guard. And on some level, as a backup offensive lineman, you have to have versatility. So he's worth watching in this game for those reasons. It's not necessarily going to be a situation where, look, I'd love to see him ready for week one. I'd love to see him on that Monday night against Buffalo. I'd love to see him at center, snapping the ball to Aaron Rodgers, but it may not go that way. And if it doesn't, then the next best hope is that at some point this season, he'll be ready to take on a bigger role. He'll be able to step into the starting lineup at some spot. Maybe it's guard, maybe it's center. I've even heard some suggestions, maybe he's got the size to play tackle. Who knows? But Tippmann's development, I think these next few games are going to be pretty significant for him for the reasons I laid out with Zach Wilson. It's going to be an opportunity to get real game experience, but in a low pressure setting. This podcast is not going to crush him if he goes out and plays poorly in preseason. This podcast will praise him if he plays great, though. So it's a good spot for young players. Live game action in the preseason. Let's see if Joe Tippmann can take advantage. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this Thursday edition of the show. We'll talk about a wide receiver who turned heads in training camp, but did not turn heads the first preseason game. That's ahead here on this Thursday Locked On Jets episode. Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're focused on this weekend's preseason game between the Jets and the Carolina Panthers. Talked about a couple players on the offense so far. We've talked about Zach Wilson. We've talked about Joe Tippmann. Let's talk about Jason Brownlee now. This is a guy who got as much hype as any young Jets player in training camp. In fact, it's almost like Jason Brownlee got more hype than the early draft picks. I heard more about this guy turning heads. He's an undrafted signing out of Southern Mississippi. He was turning heads. You heard more about him than you heard about Will McDonald. You heard more about him than you heard about Joe Tippmann. This guy was like the star of early training camp. And as we all know, sometimes that leads you on to something. I remember back in 2016, same position, wide receiver, there was a lot of talk early in training camp about Robbie Anderson looking like a player. And Robbie Anderson, of course, turned into a good starter for the Jets over the next couple of seasons. But in that training camp, you also heard a lot of big things about Jalen Marshall and Sharon Peake. And I distinctly remember, and this was like the first year of Locked On Jets. We began, I think it was like August of 2016. So this may have been one of the first few episodes. I remember saying, of these three guys getting hype, probably one of them will make it. And that ended up being the case. It ended up being Robbie Anderson. Now, before you give me too much credit, the guy I predicted would make it was Sharon Peake. So obviously I was right and I was wrong. I was right with the quantity, not with the actual player. Brownlee, I thought, was disappointing in the first preseason game. I was expecting him to go out and dominate because of what you heard he was doing at training camp, because of the level of competition. 2 catches for 17 yards. Now, he made a nice adjustment on a poorly thrown short pass and caught a ball away from his body. So that was a nice play. But then 2 passes that, I don't know if they were drops. You may argue they weren't quite drops. 2 passes that hit him in the hands that he could have come down with. I think wide receiver is a tough spot for the Jets this year because there's still this theory out there Corey Davis is getting cut. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would imagine, just based on what we know about the NFL, if it was going to happen, odds are it would have happened a long time ago. Of course, there are always surprise moves the team makes, but why would you cut Corey Davis now? I mean, look, we're all in. we're going to cut one of the best receivers on the team for cap purposes right before the start of the season when you can't replace him with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But even if Davis is cut, you still have 4 guys who are guaranteed a spot. Garrett Wilson's going to be on the team. Again, cutting edge analysis right here. Garrett Wilson is making the Jets team. That's why you tune into the show, to get analysis like that. Alvin Lazard is making this team. Mecole Hardman's making this team. Randall Cobb's certainly making this team. They brought him in because Aaron Rodgers wanted him, not because Randall Cobb's a particularly dynamic receiver at this point of his career. So that's 4 spots. Let's say Corey Davis is here. That's 5. Are you going to keep more than 6? So even if Davis is gone, there's only 2 spots available. And if Davis is here, which still seems like the most likely scenario, there's only 1 spot available. And your number 6 receiver, if he can't play special teams, and maybe we got to watch Brownlee on special teams in this game, but if your number 6 receiver can't play special teams, that's an issue. So he's really got to go out and perform on the offense. And part of me wonders whether maybe this is a guy people are kind of missing the boat on. Maybe people are impressed by him in training camp going up against guys who aren't that great at corner because he's probably playing against lower level type corners on the Jets roster. But other guys stood out on special teams in this game, in the first preseason game. And if that continues, because your number 6 receiver is not going to see the field much on offense unless you're decimated by injuries at the receiver position, where he may actually get on the field and may actually have an impact on your team is on a coverage unit, maybe as a punt gunner, maybe as a kickoff coverage guy. And if Brownlee's not going to even produce at receiver, it makes the call way easier, because I think there is at least an argument to be made. Well, this guy's producing at receiver. In case we have injuries, we'll value this over special teams. I don't know that I buy that argument, but there's at least an argument to be made if Brownlee is completely lighting it up. You just say, you know what, we don't want to risk losing this guy on the practice squad. We'll just roster him. We'll keep him on the 53, and maybe we'll just figure out a way to work around it on special teams. But if Brownlee's not going to go out and produce, he's going to have issues. Now, he can make this a much more difficult decision for the Jets. He could go out and have a big game. He could also show some value on special teams, like some of his fellow competitors at receiver did against Cleveland. But I actually think this could be a big game for Brownlee. A lot of people are saying he's a lock. I'm not entirely sure. Based on what I've heard, I think it's more likely than not. But do I think it's a guarantee? I don't know yet. And another shaky game, that has a way of changing things in the NFL. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast, just give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching this episode on YouTube, give us a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more about the Jets' second preseason game against the Carolina Panthers.